What's up, guys? Welcome back to Katson's Corner. Here to talk about another week of college football. Little bit of a sleepier week this week, obviously, with the Chargers on bye. Some less exciting stuff. I'm hoping that my voice is back to normal. I've been resting all day. I am a little bit under the weather this week, so just bear with me if I sound a little bit weird or if there's a couple moments here where I have to stop to cough or something like that. I'm totally fine. I should be fine day or two, but just woke up with a cold this morning. You know how it goes. Getting into that time of year. Make sure you get your flu shots and all that stuff. Um, we are going to talk about some more college football prospects as we have done every single week on this show. Before we do that, make sure, of course, that you are subscribed to the channel. Hit the notification bell, do all the stuff so that you make sure you get all the shows from me and Alex and Arjun and Steven and Tyler. You guys know the deal, all that stuff. And then if you like me in particular, of course, you can go follow me on Twitter at Alex Katson, just spelled like my name is, the way that you see it on the screen, in the title, in the description, and the everything. You guys know the deal with that as well. All my stuff with Chargers Wire and all that sort of stuff. You guys know the deal. We're going to go ahead and get into this week's guys. Chargers only went to one game this week, but it was a pretty big one. They were there for the Red River rivalry, shootout, whatever they call it now. Shootout, I guess, was too aggressive of a name, so they changed it to Showdown for a while, and then I think now it's just rivalry. But Oklahoma versus Texas, they were there for that game. They also went to Monmouth practice. Monmouth, a school out in New Jersey. Excuse me. Yeah, Monmouth, a school out in New Jersey. FCS school, competes at a lower level, but there's a couple guys that we could talk about. We're going to talk about one of them in particular for this week's episode. Since they only went to one game, we're going to talk about two guys each from Oklahoma and Texas because these are two teams that are pretty loaded with talent. Texas was a top three team in America before they lost this game to Oklahoma. Now Oklahoma's up in the top five. So that should give you a pretty decent idea of the kind of talent hanging out on these rosters. Plenty of guys that are going to be playing in the NFL. Two quarterbacks that I think probably get drafted eventually. We're not going to talk about them so much because this is a video about the Chargers, and the Chargers don't need a quarterback, and they won't need one for probably a decade, unless you're talking about backups, which is a whole different discussion, especially this year after they just used to pick on it last year. We are going to start instead with a center. Andrew Rame is how I think you say his last name. This is a guy we talked about in the preview for next week's games in last week's episode. We did preview the Red River game going into last week. We were talking about Rame versus those NFL quality defensive tackles that Texas has, Tavondre Sweat, Alfred Collins, those sorts of guys. Rame, I thought, had a pretty good game on Saturday, held up pretty well. He's a former four-star recruit. This is his third year starting for the Sooners. He's been pretty decent the whole time that he's been there. Guy who's starting to pop on draft radars now as a senior, has put together some really nice tape over the last few years combined. Kind of guy where people start to ask questions about, like, you're watching this Oklahoma offense for like Dylan Gabriel and that sort of thing. And you're like, wow, who's this guy? Rame is a pretty coordinated athlete. Moves pretty light for a guy that's listed at 300 pounds. I like his movement skills a decent bit. He is a better run blocker than pass blocker at this stage. I think he's pretty significantly so. A little bit just kind of looks like uncomfortable in pass sets a lot of the time. You see some of my other bullet points there. Like, he's a little bit slow to pick up some pass rush games. What I mean by that is just like if the defense is running like a stunt or a twist or any of that sort of stuff where it's like not just a rusher coming directly at him off the snap. He does have a tendency to be a little bit slow to pick that sort of thing up. Center is a position where, like, you really want those guys to be super sharp about that sort of thing. Obviously, of course, because, like, if they're not, then it leads to pressure on your quarterback. But also, just like center in particular is one of the most cerebral positions in football, probably second behind quarterback, at least on offense. And so the guys that succeed in the NFL and the guys that hang around in the NFL are almost overwhelmingly the guys that are just like super, super smart and like have a total handle on everything that's going on at all times, no matter like what their actual talent level is. I think you've seen this with the Chargers this season with Will Clapp stepping in for Corey Linsley while he deals with that heart issue that he has. Will Clapp is one of those guys who's just like super whip smart about everything. He's like very familiar with the like protection scheme that the Chargers run, and so like you saw him step in against the Raiders and have what I thought was a pretty decent game, be able to kind of like keep the ship going. Um, and so that's always a trait that you're looking for in centers. I think Rame is a little bit behind where you'd like him to be in terms of like a plug and play NFL starter. He definitely has the athleticism of one, just isn't quite there like on the mental side of things yet. Um, his pad level gets a little bit high in pass protection. Like I said, he just looks like a little bit stiff a lot of times, which is weird because I know he's a good athlete because I see him operating in space in the run game. So I think it's just like a comfort thing. Um, I think that he's someone that you definitely look at as like a day 3 pick, as kind of like a developmental center, someone that you're going to kind of stash on the bench for a year or two, and then hopefully like kind of uh, give him a pretty decent on ramp to start in year 2, year 3, maybe even year 4, and really hit the ground running. Which I think also makes him someone that the Chargers could be very interested in. Obviously, with Lindsay's situation, we don't know really any details other than like it's a heart issue. He will probably not come back this season, just because like any intervention for any sort of heart issue is probably a months, not weeks sort of thing. Um, it sounds like he's planning on coming back and playing next season as of right now. But even if he is, I think that like this combined with the other injury history and the fact that like he just had twins during training camp, I think kind of like you have to start asking the question about like what does life look like after Corey Linsley, just because like it looks like maximum there's like maybe like 1 or 2 years left of him playing in the NFL. Just the way that I see it, at least right now. And so you do need to be thinking about a succession plan, I think, at this point. Will Clapp is not that. As much as I think that he has performed well and like is a pretty good spot starter, he's not going to be someone that like I want to be starting like a full season or like going into the season as a starter. So succession plan is something to start thinking about, I think. Rame is a guy who I really like in the later rounds as a potential guy for that spot as well. Moving to the defensive side of the ball for Oklahoma, we've got a safety, Billy Bowman Jr., who had a pretty decent game in this matchup with Texas on Saturday. I thought he played really well. He's a top 40 recruit from 2021. He was actually the number 40 recruit, number 5 athlete, I believe, number 2 recruit from the state of Texas. Um, so really, really super highly recruited guy, really high 4-star recruit, was close to being a 5-star. He's someone that could come back next season and not enter the draft until 2025 because he's a true junior, and there's not really a good handle on like where his stock is draft wise. Like in doing my research about him before I hit record here, I wasn't really able to find a lot of other like draft publications that have gotten up to speed on him yet, which is good for business for me, both because like now I can tell you about him for the first time, and also because after this I'm going to go see if I have any Oklahoma tape to go write him up and be the first one to write an article about him. So that's good. Little inside baseball for you there. Um, excuse me. But Bowman, like I said, super highly touted recruit, had a good game against Texas. Kind of a JT Woods-esque player, I guess, if you have to compare him to someone that's on the Chargers. I don't think that they're super similar, but Bowman has that same sort of speed. He's a sub 4.4 guy, very versatile guy. Oklahoma moves him all over the field. He mostly plays either free safety or slot corner. His first 2 years at Oklahoma, he was mostly playing in the slot, and then this year he's played more of a traditional like free safety sort of role. Um, He's got great ball skills, super productive around the ball at the catch point, does a really good job there. One of the things so far this season that I've noticed is that he's really improved as a tackler. Last year out of the slot, it was kind of up and down. It was not like the greatest I've ever seen. really more of a Charger style corner or DB in the tackling department up until this season. But this year he's really improved. He's shown some better physicality. I really liked watching him make strides in that area. He is undersized at 5'9", 190. So it's someone who you might be might be looking to move back into the slot when he gets into the NFL. I think that's perfectly reasonable expectation. That does open the question of like how valuable is he to the Chargers specifically, given that they like Jaw Taylor at slot, but they need kind of a safety. If you don't think Bowman is going to be a traditional safety in the league, then like you kind of get into a dicey question about like what his fit would be with the Chargers. I do think in zone coverage, he does tend to get a little bit antsy. You can see him get caught with his eyes in the backfield a couple times, like watching the quarterback a little bit too hard. Sometimes just kind of gets a little bit crossed up in zone, peels off his assignments a little bit too early because he's like looking to make a play. Again, something that he's cut down on in 2023 so far. I want to see that maintain over a full season. But this is a guy who I have a friend who's pretty close to the Oklahoma program. I asked him about him before I hit record here. And this is a guy who has rave reviews in that program. They really, appreciate his work ethic. He's really like, he knows the areas where he needs to improve, and he's really like put in the work to improve in those areas this season. Someone who I think is going to do pretty well in interviews. And yeah, like I said, really no gauge on like where his draft stock is right now. The safety class is kind of in flux in general so far this season. So someone that we could see like maybe as early as like day 2 even. So someone to keep an eye on for sure. Moving on to the Texas side of things, we're going to talk about Jvon Sanders, their tight end, who I think we've touched on briefly on the show before. I think it was just in one of those like preview things, probably for Texas, Alabama, talking about him versus like Malachi Moore a couple weeks ago. For my money, Sanders is the best receiving tight end in college football right now, unless I'm forgetting someone, which I hope I'm not. But he's just an incredible weapon for them. Really, his breakout season was last year as a true sophomore. Really put together a good season there. Um, he's kind of like Dalton Kincaid from last year, if you remember, which I know a lot of Chargers fans wanted LA to draft Dalton Kincaid in the first round. He's kind of like Kincaid. I would say that he's probably a better playmaker than Kincaid was, and he has less production. Like Texas throws him the ball less frequently, but when they do, it's kind of like on different routes. And so he kind of uh, produces in a different manner than Kincaid does. But the reason that I invoke that name is because it's one that Chargers fans are familiar with from following the draft last season, and also because the same reason why I think the Chargers weren't super interested in Dalton Kincaid is probably the same reason why I think that they'll have reservations about Sanders, which is that neither of them are very good at blocking. Sanders is not a good run blocker. I would go so far as to say he's a bad run blocker. And he's really just a big wide receiver at this point, which is cool. And it's good, and it fits in the modern NFL because the modern NFL is trending much more towards these sort of like offensive weapon sort of tight ends. Obviously, like with the Kyle Pitts pick a few years ago, which is not really super panned out. The Chargers are not going to trade for him before you ask me. The Falcons are not going to trade that guy. But you think about guys like that have come into the league over the last few seasons, of like guys that are really like focused on more of the receiving side of things than the blocking side. But the Chargers had their reservations about Kincaid with the blocking stuff. There was also the back injury that Kincaid had that kind of made things weird. I think that they'll have those same issues with Sanders if the issues, if that's still an issue to them. Um, but he's worth bringing up because he's going to be one of the top tight ends this year. The Chargers still need a tight end because they didn't address it at all, let alone with Dalton Kincaid last season in what is widely regarded as the best tight end draft ever, which remains baffling to me, but we can talk about that later. Um, I do also think that Sanders is less impressive as a vertical threat, just like in general. He's much better as an underneath guy, kind of like a drag, sort of like bailout option, and then like have him just generate yards after the catch because he's very good at that. Kind of Gerald Everett-esque in that way, I guess. It's kind of like never going to really run like a route like 20, 30 yards downfield, but we'll always kind of run those like 5 to 10 yard routes and then just kind of like bounce off a couple guys and gain a bunch of tough yards. Very similar in that respect. Everett's contract is up after this season. I think that Sanders is someone that the Chargers could look to. Probably right now, I would much rather see him in day two than at like the back half of the first. But once you get in the second round and everything, things get a little bit dicey with valuations and everything. So we'll have to see. Moving to the defensive side for Texas, we're going to talk about linebacker Jaylen Ford, who we've mentioned briefly on this show before as well. When we mentioned it before, it was in the context of, again, previewing a game prior to their week ahead. But I'm pretty sure that I mentioned that he's like someone that Senior Bowl director Jim Nagy has talked about pretty glowingly on Twitter. Someone that was kind of like whose name was kind of floating around scouting circles pretty early into the season. That buzz has continued through 5 weeks. I would say that like through this point of the college football season, he's probably the guy that I've heard about the most after not hearing about him at all over the summer. Um, and now like is someone that most people are talking about in some respect. Um, he's drawn some comparisons to his former teammate, who was in last year's draft, DeMarvion Overshown, who was a guy that I liked for the Chargers. I know a couple other of you guys out there liked for the Chargers as well, as kind of like a, super athletic, very good in coverage, linebacker prototype guy. Overshown ends up going to the Cowboys. He tore his ACL in training camp. He's out for the year. So we're not going to see him this season, see what he looks like in the NFL to kind of get a baseline for like what Ford might look like. But he has drawn those comparisons as kind of a similar guy. I don't think he's as good of an athlete as Overshown was. If I remember right, Overshown got pretty close to a 10 RAS. I think it was in the 9.9s, if not like the 9.8s or 9.7s, I think. Ford, I don't think is going to get all the way up there. He's not the same sort of like straight line athlete, doesn't have that same sort of speed. Um, he is still super rangy in run defense. I think that he looks a lot like Overshown does because Overshown had the speed to make up for the fact that he didn't really have plus instincts. And Ford has the instincts to make up for the fact that he doesn't really have plus speed. And so they end up looking like similar run defense players just because they end up making plays at similar points. But for Ford, it's because he's jumping it and he's there like when the play gets there. And for Overshown, it's because like he sees it late, but he's so fast that he gets there by the time the play is there. Um, with all that said about Ford's athleticism, I do think that he's still plenty athletic enough to play in coverage. He's not someone that you want like matched up with slot receivers, but there are very few linebackers in the league that you do want to match up with slot receivers. Obviously, we've seen the Fred Warner discourse about covering Brandon Cooks on Sunday Night Football, which that's a whole different deal. Obviously, Fred Warner is the best linebacker in the league, but he's Ford is not going to be a guy that's covering slot receivers or anything. But I think that he's fully capable of covering tight ends, fully capable of playing zone coverage. Does get a little bit gullible at times. Gets caught looking in the backfield, kind of the same deal as we were talking about with Bowman just now. Just kind of like most college guys are like that, but just kind of like gets caught guessing a couple times and it hurts him a little bit. As of right now, I think that he's kind of in that exact range that DeMarvion Overshown was in, that same range that like Deion Henley was in last year, where like third round is probably about as high as I'd want to see him. I could see it all the way as down, down as far as like the fifth round, somewhere in that like late day 2, early day 3 range, I think is the sweet spot. But someone to keep an eye on because he is continuing to rise further and further up. If you would ask me in the summer, I would have said, "Who is that?" And then a couple weeks later after that, I would have probably said, like, "Oh yeah, it's a pretty decent day 3 guy," and now we're talking about him as like a potential third rounder. So it's only going further up from here. We'll probably plateau eventually. We're not going to be talking about him in the top 15 at any point or anything, but someone to keep an eye on. Had a good game against Oklahoma. We'll continue to have a good season with the rest of Texas's schedule. Someone I'm interested in watching for the rest of this year for sure. Moving on to Monmouth, like I said, the Chargers were at practice this week along with a few other NFL teams. Monmouth put out a tweet about it. I think the Rams were there as well. On the surface, it's a very strange school to go and visit in the middle of the season. Like I said, it's an FCS program. It's not even a particularly like good FCS program. Like it's a decent one. They produce NFL players pretty regularly, but it's not like your North Dakota States, your South Dakota States, like all these teams that are like competing for championships in the FCS. However, I looked into it a little bit, and there are like 2 or 3 guys from Monmouth that are draft eligible this season that are good, that, like, are on watch lists and, like, people know about and, all this stuff, and also just, like, it's NFL scouts, they're gonna go to every school all the time, it's, like, all these that, like, we report on and, like, get reported and I do videos about and stuff, like, is really only, like, probably half of not even half of the legwork that scouts are out there doing on the road all season. It's just about, like, what gets out to the public and what doesn't. But the one I'm most interested in from Monmouth is their wide receiver, Dymere Miller. He's on the Shrine Bowl watch list, which is how I found his name in the first place. Um, Really interesting story. Basically got no playing time until his senior year of high school. He herniated a disc in his back as a high school sophomore. Spent like 2.5 years rehabbing that. Basically didn't play at all. Missed like I think still like the first 3 games of his senior year, was thinking like he wasn't going to play football in college. He was just going to give it up, and then like just blasts off his senior year of high school. Gets a couple like D2 offers. Really thinks that he's a D1 caliber player. His high school coach knows some guys at a prep school, and so he goes there for a year. Has another great season. Ends up at Monmouth with like a year of high school and a year of prep school production under his belt. So like really was not on any FBS radars whatsoever. Ends up at Monmouth. Um, Kind of takes a back seat to some of their other like productive receivers that they've had over the last couple years, and then breaks out last season, or at least everyone else except for him calls it a breakout, because he leads the team in receptions, yards, and touchdowns last season. But then in an interview that he did before this season, he said, "Oh, I wouldn't call that a breakout season because I was playing through an injury almost the whole year. He had a shoulder injury almost the whole season." Um, and he caught like 60 passes for like 700 yards and 7 touchdowns or something like that. And he was just like, "Yeah, no, I had a shoulder injury all season. I wouldn't call that a breakout season. This year, though, watch." And through 5 games, he has more than double the receptions the second guy on the team has. He has 42 receptions. The next guy has 17. He's got more than double the receiving yards that second on the team has. He's got 526. The next guy has 261. He leads the team in touchdowns with 4. The next guy's at 3. Um, and like is just like stomping FCS competition, which is what you want from a prospect at this level. Um, there is a pretty lengthy injury history concern. Obviously, we talked about like the back injury. He's got a shoulder injury that he's playing through for most of last season. So like the medicals are going to be interesting. He's also only a fourth-year player. He's a redshirt junior this season, so there's not even any guarantee that he enters the draft this year. He might enter the portal. He might go back to Monmouth for a 5th year. He might do any number of things. This could be someone that like we see it like James Madison next season for all I know. But I do think that it's interesting that like 5 or 6 NFL teams went to practice this week, because they have him and they have an offensive tackle who's pretty decent. They have a running back who's pretty decent. It's a lot of guys that are pretty decent players, FCS level players. Even when you're like stomping competition like this, most of the time those guys are UDFAs. So we're looking at probably a UDFA level guy, but someone who I think is interesting if he stays healthy and he stays on the field. Really has like untapped potential because he has really only played like 4.5 seasons of football since he was like 16. And when he does get on the field, he's good. So someone to keep an eye on, just like a name to file away. Even if he ends up like entering the portal or something and ends up at like a G5 school, just like someone to keep an eye on, someone I'm interested in. Moving on to next week's games, we're gonna run through these pretty quickly because we are running out of time. Number one game next week, Oregon, Washington. Watch the game. Just watch the whole thing. I don't even have specific matchups or anything to tell you about. There are so many NFL players on both of these teams. It's by far the best game of the week. College Game Day is going to be there. The whole media circus is going to be there. It's going to be on ABC at 12:30. Like it's the rare like Pac-12 midday kickoff game. Washington obviously has the 3 great NFL caliber receivers. Oregon's got a couple NFL caliber corners. Oregon has a couple NFL caliber receivers, but Washington has an NFL caliber corner, Jabbar Muhammad. There's great edge rushers on both sides. There's great defensive linemen on both sides. There's great offensive linemen on both sides. There's great quarterbacks on both sides. Like the whole game, just all of it, the whole thing is going to be fantastic. Just watch that entire game. Make a note of the guys that you like. Feel free to send them to me if you don't know anything about them or anything. I'd be more than happy to pass along some notes on guys for that game because these are two schools that I interact with very closely. UW especially as an alum, and so these are two schools that have followed like super closely, and I try to like stay unbiased when covering them. But these two teams have a ton of NFL talent. They're both top 10 in the country. This game's going to be awesome. Just watch the whole game. Moving on, we have Miami, North Carolina, which is another ranked versus ranked matchup. I try to give you guys mostly games that you can watch on TV pretty easily to kind of get an idea of some guys. Miami receiver Xavier Restrepo had a really big game last week against Georgia Tech. That game that Miami ends up losing in just like unspeakable fashion because Mario Cristobal doesn't know how to kneel the football. But Restrepo had a really big game. It was kind of like his breakout game so far this season. I'm interested to see if he continues that momentum. Miami has a couple other like big name sort of guys that don't really like do anything. Tyler Harrell's an Alabama transfer, and then they have I'm blanking on the other kid's name, but they have another guy who's like there, and is like a kind of a big deal recruit. But Restrepo was the best one against Georgia Tech. I think that he's probably been the best one all season so far. I'm interested to see if he continues that against North Carolina team. And then for UNC, Devontae Walker just got ruled eligible by the NCAA before last week's game. He's been going through a whole eligibility battle with them about his transfer status and everything. Got to play last week, was pretty quiet, but like is also pretty clearly UNC's best receiver on the field. I don't necessarily think that it's a coincidence that Drake May had his best game of the season, the first game that Walker's allowed to play. And so I'm interested to see how that goes because with another game of ramp up, you're getting closer to like being in like full like game midseason shape for Walker. I think that he's someone that could potentially have a pretty big game in this Miami game. Could be a pretty pretty big deal and like who wins this game. So someone I'm keeping an eye on. He's someone that I've been following since he was at Kent State last year with Sean Lewis and all those guys. So pretty interested in that one. UCLA Oregon State is going to be a pretty good game, I think, as well. Oregon State still ranked in the top 20, I want to say. UCLA, I think, has fallen out of the rankings now, but they have one of the best defenses in the country, led by edge Laiatu Latu, the Washington transfer. Very, very Jalen Phillips-esque has been all of his comps so far. Kind of similar trajectories, excuse me. Phillips obviously was at UCLA, had the neck injury, ends up transferring to Miami, where he breaks out and becomes a first-round pick. Latu's at Washington, has the neck injury, ends up transferring to UCLA instead of away, and now had a breakout 2022 season. He's back for more in 2023. He's lived up to the billing. Oregon State has two NFL quality offensive tackles, so no matter what side you put him on, put Latu on in this game, he's going to be going up against a future NFL guy. Excited to see how that one goes. Oregon State receiver Silas Bolden had a really big game 2 weeks ago against Washington State, I think it was. Kind of a similar player to Darius Davis, like 5'8", returner type guy, really jittery in open space. Don't think he's necessarily someone that's like on the Chargers radar because they have Davis, but someone to keep an eye on nonetheless. And then Deshaun Fenwick, who's the backup running back for the Beavers, still gets about 30 snaps a game. Damian Martinez is their starter. He's a true sophomore, someone we're going to be talking about pretty early next season. But Fenwick is a good player. I think that he's just a victim of circumstance more than anything else. Those sorts of guys end up being UDFAs, and then they get to the NFL, and you're like, hey, wait, this guy's good. What? How did we not draft this guy? So sort of similar to like a Jaylen Warren type guy for the Steelers, where he was the backup to Chuba Hubbard at Oklahoma State, gets the NFL as a UDFA because he never really played, and it's like, wait, this guy's good. And then last game here, Wyoming versus Air Force. I think the winner of this game probably wins the Mountain West eventually. Wyoming linebacker Easton Gibbs is kind of the centerpiece of that defense. It's a really good Wyoming defense. They're up against a pretty unique test this week, obviously with the triple option offense that Air Force runs. So excited to see how Gibbs handles that. He's, as far as I know, the defensive play caller on the field. And so, getting all those signals out and making sure that Wyoming has a pretty solid day against the run there is going to be interesting to me. And then Air Force has a safety who's on the watch list. Trey Taylor led the team in tackles last season, um, has been pretty productive throughout his entire career. Service Academy guys are always kind of weird. Even as UDFAs, they used to be able to just like enter the NFL right away. I don't know if that's changed with the new rules that they've instituted for service academy athletes. That whole thing is very strange to me, and it ends up like never being relevant really. So I haven't read too much into it. But he's a guy that I like a little bit. Productive guy, more of a free safety type role, but someone to keep an eye on against that Wyoming offense as well. That's going to do it for this week, guys. Again, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, follow me on Twitter, follow the show on Twitter. All those links and stuff are in the description, I'm sure. Steven does a great job organizing all that for me every week. Hope you guys are excited for this week of college football. Hope you guys are excited for the Chargers to come back on Monday night. We will be back on Tuesday as normal, even with the Monday night game happening, as far as I know. Things could change. They might tell me something else. I'm not really sure yet. But as far as I know, we'll be back on Tuesday to break down the week that was in college football, look ahead to the week ahead. We're approaching 150 prospects that we've talked about this season. I've been having a blast. Hope you guys have been as well. And yeah, I will catch you next time. See you.